No one noticed the waitress when she walked into Blackwood Estate that night. She was just another worker in a black uniform, carrying a tray of champagne through a ballroom, filled with the richest and most powerful people in the city. To them, Ivy Harlo was invisible, a quiet girl trying to survive another long shift. But what Ivy didn't know was that this wedding was not a normal celebration. The guests whispering beneath the crystal chandeliers were not ordinary humans. They were vampires, ancient, powerful, and dangerously hungry. Hidden among them was a king feared by every vampire clan in the world. Theon Ashcroft had come to this wedding for one reason: revenge. But fate had other plans, because the moment the Vampire King saw the quiet waitress standing alone among the guests, everything changed. In a room filled with monsters, he chose the one person who was human. And that single choice would ignite a war, break ancient vampire laws, and transform the invisible waitress into something no one in that room expected. A queen. She came to serve drinks. But the mirrors showed something that wasn't human. Ivy Harlo had mastered the art of being unseen. Not the poetic kind, just the survival kind. The kind you learn when you're a broke waitress in a city that never apologizes. 26 years old, student loans that felt like shackles, and a mother whose heart medication cost more than Ivy's monthly groceries. She worked events where rich people threw away what she prayed for. She smiled when she was ignored. She nodded when she was insulted. She kept going because quitting was a luxury she couldn't afford. That morning, her alarm buzzed at 4:30 like a warning siren. Ivy didn't hit snooze. She unplugged it in the dark and sat up slowly, feeling the familiar ache in her back and feet, the pain that came from standing for years with a tray balanced like her life depended on it. On her counter, a stack of bills waited like silent judges. Rent, utilities, loan payments, and a pharmacy receipt she hadn't been able to pay last week her mother's prescription. Ivy stared at it for one long moment and promised herself, the way she always did, that today would be different. Today was Blackwood Estate. The catering company called it a high society wedding. The kind of event where tips could change your month, where the guests wore diamonds like they were buttons. Ivy told herself she would be invisible, collect her money, and go home. She told herself nothing bad could happen in a place this expensive. But the moment the van rolled into the Hudson Valley and the mansion rose out of the trees like a Gothic nightmare, her stomach tightened. Blackwood Estate didn't look like a home. It looked like a fortress pretending to be a palace. Dark stone, tower spires, windows like watching eyes. Even in daylight, the place seemed to swallow the sun. Inside the service entrance, the staff manager Rory, exhausted and sharp-lined them up like soldiers. His voice was clipped, serious in a way Ivy had never heard at a wedding. He didn't say, "Be professional," like usual. He said it like a warning. "You will be invisible," Rory told them. "No eye contact. No talking unless spoken to. Serve and disappear." The other servers nodded, nervous chuckles dying quickly in their throats. Ivy felt a cold slide down her spine. Something about Rory's tone made it feel like this wasn't about rude guests. It was about staying alive. The kitchen was massive, and yet the food being prepared felt wrong. Everything was raw or barely touched by heat. Beef tartare, rare tuna, oysters on ice. Nothing warm, nothing comforting. Ivy told herself it was just fancy cuisine. But the smell in the air wasn't just seafood and herbs. Underneath, it was something metallic, faint and sweet like old pennies. When Rory handed Ivy a tray of champagne, his eyes didn't meet hers. "Ballroom," he said. "East side. Offer drinks. Don't linger." Ivy adjusted her grip, straightened her shoulders, and stepped through the corridor toward the ballroom. The hall was lined with portraits oil paintings of men and women in old-fashioned clothes. Their faces were too serious, too watchful. Ivy kept her eyes forward, but she could swear the painted gazes followed her like they were alive. Then she reached the ballroom doors, 12 feet tall, carved oak, iron hinges like medieval armor. 2 guards stood on either side, tall and silent, scanning her like she was something that might break. Ivy walked in and froze. The room was enormous vaulted ceilings, chandeliers dripping crystal, marble floors that shone like water. 300 guests filled the space in black tie and designer gowns. But the sound wasn't right. No laughter. No casual chatter. Just whispers. Quiet, low, coordinated like a meeting disguised as a celebration dot, and it was cold. The fireplaces were lit, but the air felt like winter had been trapped inside the walls. Ivy began offering champagne, smile fixed in place. She moved from group to group, practiced and smooth. But the guests did something she wasn't used to. They didn't look at her eyes. They looked at her throat. Hands reached for glasses hands that were too cold. Voices thanked her politely, but their focus never broke from the pulse beating beneath her skin. Ivy told herself it was her imagination. Told herself she was tired. Told herself this was just a weird rich people vibe. Then she saw the mirrors, massive gilded. Mirrors lined sections of the ballroom, placed to reflect chandeliers and opulence. Ivy paused near one, pretending to adjust her tray, and glanced into the reflection. Her breath caught in the mirror. A man near the corner looked hollow, his face slack as if his soul had been scooped out. A woman beside him smiled with a mouth too wide, teeth too many, jaw stretching wrong, like a snake preparing to swallow. Ivy blinked hard. Normal. The mirror now showed exactly what it should. Elegant guests, perfect smiles, expensive beauty. Ivy's hands shook, and the champagne glasses clinked together just once. But in that quiet ballroom, the sound rang out like a bell. Heads turned. Dozens, then more. Eyes fixed on Ivy like she had just announced herself as prey. Her earpiece crackled. Rory's voice snapped through. Harlo, East Wing VIP Lounge. Red wine spilled on the white furniture. Get there now. Ivy didn't hesitate. She practically fled through a side door, grateful for an excuse to leave the staring. The hallway outside felt even colder. The air carried that metallic sweetness again, stronger here, like something had been spilled recently. Ivy followed the signs to the VIP lounge and pushed open. Heavy oak doors. The room was empty. White velvet furniture set pristine around a marble fireplace except for one stain on a couch. Dark red, too dark to be wine. Almost black. Ivy set the tray down and knelt with a cloth, scrubbing gently, heart still racing. The smell hit her fully now. Blood. The door clicked shut behind her. Ivy turned, standing quickly. A man leaned against the door, locking it with one smooth motion. He was tall, impossibly composed. Dark hair swept back from a face that looked carved rather than born. His presence sucked the air out of the room. It wasn't just beauty. It was power ancient, cold, and absolute. His eyes were so dark, they seemed to swallow light. He was bleeding. A thin line of crimson ran from his temple. "Sir, are you hurt?" Ivy asked, voice steady only because fear made her rigid. "I can call security." He laughed softly, humorless. "Security is the reason I'm bleeding, sweetheart." Before Ivy could back away, the door handle rattled violently. Something slammed against the wood from outside. A furious voice roared, packed with hatred. "Open up." The man's gaze sharpened. He looked at Ivy like she was a chess piece he hadn't expected. "Listen carefully," he murmured, stepping closer. "In 10 seconds, that door breaks. If they find me alone, I die. If they find me with a hostage, they kill us both. But if they find me with a lover, they hesitate. Rules, politics. Ivy's mouth went dry. I don't understand. Act like you belong to me, he said, voice turning into command. Smile. Hold me. Or we die here. The door cracked. Ivy's mind flashed to her mother's medication, to bills, to a life that had never offered rescue. She didn't have time for dignity. Only survival dot, so she threw her arms around his neck and forced a bright laugh fake, trembling loud enough to sell the lie. Oh, stop, she said, dabbing his blood with the cleaning cloth like it was lipstick. I told you that was too sharp when I kissed you there. The door burst open. A groom in a white tuxedo stood in the doorway, Draven. Sinclair, his eyes flickering with something not human. Behind him, guards stared like wolves held on leashes. The groom's gaze locked onto Ivy's uniform, then up to her face, and his smile became cruel. A waitress? He sneered. How? Progressive. The man holding Ivy tightened his arm around her waist, possessive and calm, like he owned the air. Theon Ashcroft, Draven said, voice dripping venom. So you're alive after all? Theon smiled cold and dangerous. Draven, meet Ivy, my plus one. In that moment, Ivy realized two terrifying truths at once. These weren't rich guests. They were monsters, and the most feared monster in the room had just chosen her. Ivy came to serve champagne, but she walked into a hunting ground, and when the Vampire King claimed her with one touch, the entire room became her enemy. When the Vampire King placed the ancient black ring on her finger, Ivy realized, too late, it wasn't protection. It was a bond that could change her fate forever. The ballroom felt colder the moment Theon Ashcroft walked in beside Ivy, his hand firmly wrapped around hers like an unbreakable chain. Ivy tried to breathe normally, tried to remember that just 20 minutes earlier she had been a waitress carrying champagne trays, invisible among wealthy strangers. Now every guest in the room stared at her like she was something extraordinary, or something delicious. The chandeliers above glittered like frozen stars, while whispers spread through the hall, and Ivy felt the weight of hundreds of eyes tracking the pulse in her throat. Theon leaned slightly closer to her, his voice barely above a whisper, yet strangely calm. Do not look afraid, he murmured. Predators smell fear faster than blood. Ivy forced herself to straighten her posture, lifting her chin even though her heart was racing so violently she thought everyone could hear it. The orchestra began playing a slow classical waltz, and couples drifted across the marble floor with movements too graceful to be entirely human. Ivy noticed it now, the way their reflections flickered strangely in the tall silver mirrors lining the walls, the way their smiles looked just a little too sharp. She swallowed hard. You said they were vampires, she whispered under her breath. All of them? Theon's dark eyes scanned the room like a general studying a battlefield. Most of them, he replied quietly. The Sinclair and Wolf clans rule the Eastern Territories. Tonight they planned to celebrate their alliance, and quietly finish what they started 50 years ago. Ivy didn't need to ask what that meant. The hatred in his voice answered the question for her. Across the ballroom, Draven Sinclair stood beside the bride, Cassandra Wolf, both of them watching Ivy with unsettling focus. Cassandra's lips curved slowly, her tongue brushing across them as if tasting something sweet in the air. Ivy instinctively stepped closer to Theon. He noticed immediately. His hand tightened around hers in silent reassurance before he reached into his coat pocket and removed a small velvet box. Ivy blinked in confusion as he opened it, revealing a heavy silver ring set with a black diamond that seemed to swallow the surrounding light. The stone pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. Put it on, Theon said softly. Ivy stared at him. Why? Because without it, he replied calmly, they will treat you like prey. Her stomach twisted. She glanced again toward Draven and Cassandra, who had begun whispering to several guests, while glancing at her again and again. The tension in the room felt like the calm before a storm. Ivy took the ring with trembling fingers. It felt strangely warm despite the cold metal. Slowly she slid it onto her finger. The moment it settled into place, the diamond flashed once and tightened slightly against her skin as if it had recognized her. Ivy gasped softly. "What did you just do?" she asked. Theon's expression softened just slightly, the cold mask cracking for the first time. "I made you untouchable," he said. "That ring carries the sigil of the Ashcroft line. By ancient law, harming you would mean declaring war against my entire clan." Ivy exhaled shakily, trying to process the impossible situation she had fallen into. Around them, whispers grew louder as more vampires noticed the ring on her hand. Some looked shocked. Others looked furious. Draven Sinclair slowly raised a glass on the stage, tapping it with a spoon until silence fell across the ballroom. His voice echoed unnaturally loud through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced smoothly, "it seems our legendary guest, King Theon Ashcroft, has returned from the dead, and he has brought a human companion." The word human rippled through the crowd like a spark through dry leaves. Ivy felt the room's hunger turn toward her instantly. Draven smiled slowly. "Since she now wears the Ashcroft ring," he continued, "perhaps she will join us for the ceremonial toast." Waiters moved through the crowd, carrying glasses filled with thick dark red liquid that definitely wasn't wine. Theon leaned closer to Ivy. "Don't drink it," he whispered. But the chanting had already begun from the guests. "Drink, drink, drink." The pressure in the room felt suffocating. Ivy stared at the glass in her hand, realizing every vampire in the ballroom was waiting to see what she would do. With hundreds of vampires watching her every move, Ivy realized the smallest mistake tonight could turn her from a protected guest into the main course. When Ivy poured the blood-filled glass onto the marble floor, the entire vampire court fell silent. Because a human had just challenged them all, the chanting grew louder with every passing second as hundreds of vampire guests stared at Ivy like wolves circling their prey, their voices blending into a rhythmic pressure that echoed through the cold ballroom. "Drink, drink, drink." The sound vibrated through the marble floor beneath her feet, while the glass in Ivy's hand trembled slightly. She could smell the thick metallic scent rising from the dark red liquid, and her stomach twisted with the horrifying realization that it wasn't wine at all. It was blood. Her eyes flickered toward Theon for a moment. His expression remained calm, but she saw the warning in his gaze. "Do not drink it." Draven Sinclair stood on the raised platform at the far end of the ballroom, smiling like a man watching an entertaining performance. Cassandra Wolfe stood beside him in her white wedding dress, her eyes glowing faintly as she studied Ivy with growing interest. The room felt smaller with every second, the hunger in the air tightening around Ivy like invisible chains. She realized something terrifying then. These creatures weren't simply watching her. They were waiting for her to prove she was weak, waiting for her to act like prey. Ivy swallowed hard, forcing her trembling fingers to steady as she lifted the glass slightly. The crowd leaned forward almost as one body, anticipation flashing across pale faces. Theon stepped closer beside her, his hand brushing lightly against her arm, a silent promise that she was not alone, even in a room full of monsters. Ivy inhaled slowly. If she showed fear now, she would lose everything. The protection of the ring, the respect of the only ally she had, maybe even her life. So instead of raising the glass to her lips, Ivy slowly tilted her wrist. The dark liquid poured out in a thin stream, splashing across the spotless white marble floor like spilled ink. Gasps rippled across the ballroom instantly. The chanting stopped. Every vampire in the room froze. Ivy lowered the empty glass and looked directly at Draven Sinclair with quiet defiance burning in her eyes. "My husband doesn't drink poison," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the stunned silence. The word husband echoed strangely in the vast hall. Even Theon looked momentarily surprised by the boldness of her words. Draven's polite smile slowly disappeared. For a long moment he said nothing, staring at the spreading pool of blood on the marble floor, as if Ivy had just committed a crime beyond forgiveness. Cassandra's nails tightened around her own glass until the crystal cracked softly in her grip. The tension in the room thickened like a coming storm. Finally, Draven chuckled quietly, though the sound carried no humor at all. "How fascinating," he said slowly. "A human girl with courage." His eyes darkened as he looked at Theon. Or perhaps she simply doesn't understand the laws of our world. Around the room, whispers began spreading again as the vampires shifted restlessly, their patience wearing thin. Ivy suddenly realized she had done more than refuse a drink. She had publicly insulted the host of the gathering and rejected the ceremonial toast that sealed alliances among vampire clans. In their world, that was a declaration of hostility. Theon leaned slightly closer to her, his voice barely audible. "You just started a war," he murmured. Ivy felt her pulse hammering in her ears. Was there a peaceful option? She whispered back. For the first time since she met him, Theon's lips curved into a faint smile of genuine admiration. Before he could answer, Draven raised his hand slowly. The chandeliers above flickered once. Then the entire ballroom went dark. Chaos erupted instantly. Screams echoed, chairs overturned, and shadows moved through the darkness far faster than human eyes could track. Ivy felt Theon's hand grab hers with iron strength as he pulled her toward the nearest exit. Something slammed into a table nearby, glass shattering everywhere, while vampire voices shouted orders in the darkness. Ivy couldn't see anything, but she could hear the terrifying sounds surrounding them: snarls, rushing footsteps, and the wet tearing noise of creatures fighting in the shadows. Theon dragged her through the confusion, his movements impossibly fast and precise as he navigated the pitch-black corridor beyond the ballroom doors. Ivy stumbled once, but he caught her instantly, pulling her close as they ran deeper into the mansion's labyrinth of hallways. Behind them, the ballroom had become a battlefield, and the most powerful vampire families in the region had just become their enemies. As Theon pulled Ivy into the darkness of the estate's hidden corridors, she realized something terrifying escaping the ballroom was only the beginning of the war she had just started. As the vampires hunted them through the mansion, Ivy discovered a secret beneath Blackwood Estate that could destroy the entire vampire court. The corridor outside the ballroom was completely dark, except for faint emergency lights flickering along the walls, casting long moving shadows that made the ancient mansion feel even more dangerous. Ivy could barely keep up as Theon pulled her forward through the narrow hallway, his grip firm and protective as chaos echoed behind them. Shouting voices, breaking glass, and distant snarls filled the air while the vampire guests realized their prey was escaping. Ivy's breath came in quick bursts as they turned another corner, her heart pounding violently from both fear and adrenaline. "Where are we going?" she asked between breaths, trying not to stumble in her uncomfortable work shoes. Theon didn't slow down. His dark eyes scanned the corridor ahead like a soldier planning every step. "Somewhere they won't expect," he replied quietly. "Blackwood Estate was built centuries ago. Old vampire houses always hide secrets beneath the stone." Ivy didn't fully understand what he meant until he suddenly stopped in front of a tall wooden bookshelf built into the wall. Without hesitation, he reached forward and pulled one of the heavy books from the shelf. A deep clicking sound echoed inside the wall, and the entire shelf slowly swung open, revealing a narrow stone passage hidden behind it. Ivy stared in shock. "A secret tunnel?" she whispered. "More than one," Theon said calmly. "This mansion was built during a time when vampire wars were common. The original owners designed escape routes beneath the estate." From the distant hallways behind them, Ivy suddenly heard footsteps moving quickly closer. The vampires were searching the mansion. Without wasting another second, Theon guided her into the passage and pulled the shelf closed behind them, sealing them inside the darkness. The hidden corridor smelled like damp stone and ancient dust. Ivy pulled out her phone and switched on the flashlight, the weak beam illuminating narrow stone steps leading downward. The walls were rough and cold, carved directly from the earth centuries ago. They began moving carefully down the stairs, while the faint noises of the mansion faded above them. "Why are they so desperate to kill you?" Ivy asked quietly, the question that had been haunting her since the moment she met him. Theon remained silent for several steps before answering, his voice calm but heavy with memory. 50 years ago, the Sinclair clan betrayed my family during a peace meeting. They burned the building with my entire bloodline trapped inside. Ivy's chest tightened as she imagined the horror of that moment. "Your family," she whispered. "Everyone," Theon said simply. "Parents, brothers, sisters. My clan was wiped out in one night." Ivy felt a deep wave of sadness for the Vampire King walking beside her. Despite his power, despite the cold control he showed in every moment, she could hear the centuries of pain behind those words. "And you survived?" she asked softly. Theon's eyes reflected the light from her phone as he looked ahead into the darkness. "I arrived too late to save them, but I stayed long enough to hear the screams." The two of them reached the bottom of the stairs, where the passage opened into a larger underground chamber carved from rock. The air felt colder here, carrying the smell of wet earth and ancient stone. In the center of the cavern stood something strange, a tall, jagged crystal embedded in a stone pedestal, glowing faintly with purple symbols carved across its surface. The strange light pulsed slowly like a living heartbeat. Ivy stared at it in confusion. "What is that?" she asked. Theon stepped closer to the crystal, his expression serious. "A runestone," he explained. "It powers the magical barrier surrounding the estate. As long as it stands, no one can leave Blackwood grounds." Ivy felt hope spark inside her chest. "So if we destroy it, the barrier falls?" Theon nodded once. "Exactly." He lifted the iron fire poker he had taken earlier and stepped toward the glowing stone, preparing to smash it. But before the metal could strike the crystal, a calm voice echoed through the cavern from the darkness behind them. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Ivy spun around instantly. Draven Sinclair stepped forward from the shadows with slow, confident steps, his white tuxedo still spotless despite the chaos upstairs. In his hand, he held a smartphone. With a cruel smile, he turned the screen toward them. Ivy's breath caught in her throat. The video showed a small apartment living room. Her mother sat peacefully in her chair, watching television, completely unaware of the danger surrounding her. Draven's smile widened slightly as he watched Ivy's terrified reaction. "My associates are standing outside her door right now," he said calmly. "If you destroy that stone, they go inside." Ivy's hands began shaking uncontrollably as the horrifying truth settled in. Theon had the power to escape this trap. But if he did, her mother would die. Standing between freedom and her mother's life, Ivy realized Draven had just forced the Vampire King to make an impossible choice. Asterisk, when Draven threatened Ivy's mother, the Vampire King did something no one expected. He surrendered. The glowing runestone pulsed in the dark, cavern like a heartbeat, while silence stretched between the three of them. Ivy's eyes remained locked on the phone screen, showing her mother sitting peacefully in her small apartment, knitting quietly while the television flickered in the background. The ordinary scene felt painfully fragile now that Ivy knew danger waited just outside that door. Her hands trembled as fear tightened around her chest like a cage. Draven Sinclair watched her reaction with the calm satisfaction of a man who knew he had already won the battle. "You see," he said smoothly, lowering the phone slightly, "every powerful creature has a weakness. Theon Ashcroft's weakness is you. And yours is her." Ivy's throat tightened as she forced herself to look away from the screen and toward Theon. The Vampire King stood completely still near the glowing stone, the iron poker still raised in his hand. His dark eyes flickered between the runestone and Ivy's terrified face. If he destroyed the stone now, the magical barrier surrounding Blackwood Estate would fall, and they could escape into the night. But Draven had made the consequences very clear. Her mother would pay the price. Ivy shook her head desperately. "Theon, don't listen to him," she whispered. "You have to destroy it." But even as the words left her mouth, she knew the truth. Theon could see it too. The Vampire King slowly lowered the weapon in his hand. The iron poker slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly against the stone floor. Draven smiled immediately, pleased by the surrender he had forced. "A wise decision," he said calmly. "You always were a strategic thinker, Ashcroft." Ivy felt tears burning in her eyes as guards emerged from the shadows behind Draven, their glowing eyes fixed on Theon like hunting wolves, waiting for a command. Theon didn't resist when they grabbed his arms. Silver chains wrapped around his wrists instantly, the metal sizzling against his skin as smoke curled into the air. The Vampire King winced slightly, but remained silent, his focus fixed on Ivy rather than the guards dragging him away. "Let him go," Ivy shouted, struggling against the hands that seized her arms from behind. But more guards had already surrounded her, their grip tight as iron while they pulled her away from the cavern. Draven stepped closer, studying her face with cold interest. "You should feel honored," he said softly. "Not many humans get to witness the fall of a king." Ivy glared at him through her tears. "You'll never win," she said fiercely. Draven chuckled quietly. "Oh, I already have." He gestured toward the black diamond ring still glowing faintly on Ivy's finger. "That ring doesn't just protect you. It binds you to the Ashcroft bloodline. His territory, his wealth, his entire kingdom, legally belongs to his wife." Ivy felt dread crawl through her stomach as realization struck her. Draven wasn't interested in killing Theon immediately. He wanted something far more valuable. "Once you marry me," Draven continued calmly, "the Ashcroft kingdom becomes mine." Ivy shook her head fiercely. "I will never marry you." Draven's expression remained perfectly composed as he lifted the phone again, the video of her mother still playing on the screen. "You will," he replied quietly, "because if you refuse, your mother dies tonight." Ivy's resistance shattered instantly as fear crushed every other thought. The guards dragged her toward the tunnel, leading back up into the mansion, while Theon remained chained in the cavern behind them. As Ivy was pulled away, she turned back one last time. The Vampire King was on his knees now, the silver chains glowing faintly against his skin as the guards forced him down. Yet despite the pain, his eyes remained steady on her. His lips moved silently. Two simple words: "Act brave." The darkness of the tunnel swallowed him as the guards forced Ivy upward toward the mansion. Minutes later, she found herself in a lavish bedroom on the upper floor of the estate, the same room where the bride had prepared earlier that evening. Servants dressed her in a black lace gown taken from a dusty trunk, its old fashioned design making her look less like a waitress and more like a queen from another century. Ivy stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror above the vanity, barely recognizing the frightened woman looking back at her. The black diamond ring pulsed faintly on her finger like a living thing. A quiet knock sounded at the door. When it opened, Cassandra Wolfe stepped inside, her white wedding gown stained with dirt and anger burning in her pale eyes. She looked Ivy up and down with open hatred. "Do you know how long I planned this wedding?" Cassandra asked coldly. Ivy remained silent. Cassandra's voice trembled with fury. 2 years of alliances, negotiations, power, and now Draven throws it all away for you. Ivy met her gaze slowly. "He didn't choose me," she said quietly. "He chose power." Cassandra's expression shifted slightly, confusion flickering behind her anger. Ivy leaned forward just a little. "Think about it," she continued softly. "Once he takes the Ashcroft kingdom through me, what does he need the Wolfe family for anymore?" Cassandra froze completely as the truth began to sink in. As Cassandra slowly realized Draven's betrayal, Ivy understood something dangerous. The enemy standing in front of her might soon become her only ally. Asterisk, when the wedding ceremony began, everyone believed the human girl would be forced to surrender. But the Vampire King had already planned the final move. The grand ballroom of Blackwood Estate had been hastily repaired after the chaos earlier that night. But the atmosphere was darker now, heavier, filled with the tense anticipation of creatures waiting for something important to happen. Hundreds of vampire guests had gathered again beneath the glittering chandeliers, their cold eyes fixed on the center of the room, where a ceremonial altar had been placed. The orchestra played a slow, haunting melody that echoed across the marble floor, while servants lit tall black candles along the walls. Ivy stood at the far end of the hall, wearing the black lace gown Cassandra had forced upon her earlier, the ancient fabric brushing softly against the floor with every nervous breath she took. The black diamond ring on her finger pulsed steadily with warmth, almost as if it were alive. Her heart raced as 2 guards escorted her forward through the silent crowd. Every vampire in the room watched her closely, their expressions filled with curiosity, hunger, and expectation. On the raised platform ahead, Draven Sinclair stood waiting in his pristine white suit, looking like a groom ready for a royal wedding instead of a man who had orchestrated betrayal and imprisonment. His smile widened when Ivy approached the altar. "You see," he said quietly as she stopped a few steps away, "resistance only delays the inevitable." Ivy forced herself to remain calm, even though fear churned inside her chest. "You threatened my mother," she replied coldly. "That's not victory. That's cowardice." A few murmurs spread through the crowd at her boldness, but Draven only laughed softly. "History will remember results, not methods," he said smoothly. Behind the platform, heavy doors opened with a deep echo across the hall. 2 guards dragged Theon Ashcroft forward in silver chains. The Vampire King's wrists were bound tightly, the metal smoking against his skin as he was forced to kneel near the altar. Yet despite his weakened state, his dark eyes remained sharp and focused. The moment he looked at Ivy, something unspoken passed between them. A silent understanding. Ivy remembered the 2 words he had mouthed earlier. "Act brave." Draven raised his hand, and the music stopped instantly. The entire ballroom fell silent. "Tonight," Draven announced proudly, 2 powerful bloodlines will unite." His gaze moved from Ivy to the chained Vampire King beside the platform. "And the Ashcroft kingdom will finally belong to its rightful ruler." He extended his hand toward Ivy expectantly. "The ring." Ivy slowly stepped forward, pretending hesitation while her mind raced. She remembered something Theon had told her earlier in the underground cavern. The ring carried ancient laws older than the vampire clans themselves. Laws even Draven could not break. Ivy lifted her hand slowly so the black diamond caught the candlelight. "You want the ring?" she asked quietly. Draven nodded confidently. "Place it in my hand and the ceremony ends." For a moment, Ivy stared at the glowing stone. Then she turned suddenly toward the kneeling Vampire King. The crowd gasped as Ivy dropped to one knee beside Theon instead of giving the ring to Draven. With steady hands, she lifted the chained Vampire King's wrist slightly and pressed the glowing diamond against the silver shackles. The stone flashed brightly. A sudden burst of energy cracked through the room like thunder. The silver chains shattered instantly. Theon rose to his feet in a blur of motion, faster than human eyes could follow. Before Draven could react, the Vampire King stood between him and Ivy, his dark eyes blazing with ancient power. The ballroom erupted into chaos as shocked vampires realized the trap had been reversed. Theon's voice cut through the noise with commanding authority. "By the ancient laws of blood and bond," he declared, placing a protective arm around Ivy, "my queen has spoken." The black diamond glowed brighter than ever as Ivy stood beside him, no longer trembling. Draven staggered backward in disbelief while Cassandra watched from the edge of the room with stunned realization spreading across her face. For the first time that night, the entire vampire court saw Ivy Harlo not as prey, but as something far more dangerous. And as the Vampire King stood beside the human girl who had saved him, every creature in that room understood the truth. The invisible Waitress had just become the most powerful queen in the vampire world.